Mr. Speaker, let me begin by thanking Mr. Zeldin of New York. I thank him for his work on H.R. 4314. This is the Counterterrorism Screening and Assistance Act, as well as the other members of the Committee on Homeland Security's bipartisan task force on combating terrorist and foreign fighter travel. Under the leadership of Chairman McCall and with the significant contributions of Mr. Keiko of New York and the Foreign Affairs Committee, we unanimously approved this measure in January. And, Mr. Speaker, the reason we did goes back to a little bit of a history. Al-Qaeda planned the 9/11 attacks from Afghanistan because they had the capacity to do so, to plan an attack there on the United States. Now, ISIS controls significant territory. They control that territory in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya. And as long as terrorist groups maintain these safe havens abroad where they can work on new forms of munitions, bombing, go through trial runs on how they carry out an attack, we are under, as a consequence, we are under a threat here on our homeland, much like the situation prior to 9/11. The perpetrators of the horrific attack that we all saw on that coverage out of Paris that killed 130, those killed were European nationals. And those who did those murders, they had trained. They had trained to fight in Syria. They had traveled by train. They returned to Europe through Greece and through Turkey. And despite the fact that many of those local attackers were known by authorities, they were still able to move across borders. They moved without detection. And in some cases, they moved with those fraudulent passports. And given the high number of foreign fighters returning home from that ISIS stronghold in Syria and from the ISIS training camps in Iraq, and frankly from Libya as well, we've now heard, there is a recognized and urgent need for improved border security and information sharing between governments. This bill is a way to get there, because this threat is not just limited, by the way, to we in the United States and to Europe. Earlier this month, terrorists that had received training inside Libya were killed by Tunisian security forces during an attempted attack inside Tunisia. So, these attacks now demonstrate how easy it has become for terrorists, for foreign fighters, to move across open borders. And this legislation makes several important changes to how border security is administrated. It improves the tools deployed at the border. It increases the border security coordination between allied states. And it does it in the following way. This legislation requires the Departments of State and Homeland Security to produce an annual scorecard assessing the border security efforts of countries around the world. This is going to identify the weaknesses and areas for improvement abroad. It will also mandate a streamlining of our own efforts to assist partners overseas with their border security programs. And the administration will then submit a plan to Congress for prioritizing U.S. assistance on this. This bill requires the establishment of minimum standards for border security on the part of our allied states. And countries that meet these minimum standards can have U.S. foreign assistance suspended, cut off, employing the same incentive already in place that we use today in order to force compliance against human trafficking overseas, against those states that commit human rights violations. Many of the members here are familiar with how we leverage those states to force them to pass legislation and change their their way in which they address these issues, we're going to deploy the same leverage here. So this bill reflects the recommendations made by our colleagues on the Homeland Security's bipartisan task force on combating terrorist and foreign fighter travel, which we have worked together on. The Foreign Affairs Committee has worked with the committee on that. And I again thank Mr. Lee Zeldin for his leadership on his work to make our nation safer against this terrorist threat, and I reserve the balance of my